Hello folks. Well, most of my loyal subscribers know I was involved with pioneering lots of RC firsts back in the 70s, including the first night flying airplanes, helicopters, single-bladed machines. I experimented a lot with counter-rotating helicopters before they were invented. I call them velociraptors. Here's one. I wrote many articles on these subjects and also made many videos on them. Probably seen them. I was prompted to make this video on the Hyperfly when one of my subscribers sent me one after hearing about the fire that destroyed all my model airplanes, helicopters, equipment, cars, the garage, the house, and more. Well, the Hyperfly came to being about the time high-tech RCD radios came on the scene. Well, many of you know I helped develop the first ETRM, that's electric tail rotor motor, and used the first electric helicopter, the EH-1, for testing. I actually recently produced a video on the Skylark EH-1 when one of them was donated to me. Well, as you know, gyros were basically non-existent and they were in their infancy when I was learning to fly helicopters. The ones available needed big batteries to run and lots of room too. Remember, there weren't even PCs back then and LEDs were only red and not very bright. Well, with the slipping tail rotor belts and the tails whipping back and forth, we learned to fly, but it was a long, difficult process. Well, that led me to write NightFlyer's 9 helicopter flying tips and rules of thumb, which also you know had a video on. Well, many of the fixed-wing pilots I flew with didn't want to take all that time and frustration that it took to fly helicopters after watching me fight to learn how to hover with my American RC Manus under the watchful eye of John Simone Jr., the owner and national helicopter champion at the time. You know, with all the difficulties of the tail belt slippage, the tail boom wagging, I began experimenting with the ETRM, building a special speed controller with the help of Vic Kamosek, who owned Victor Engineering and manufactured speed controls in Laguna Hills, California. Well, we finally pulled off a speed controller, and videos and drawings and prototypes were all sent to Ishimasa in Japan. They're the company that manufactured the Skylark EH-1, which is now Kyosho, and the rest is history. But the ETRM would not work on gas helis, and there was no gyro that could be applied to it, so I began thinking, well, let's just eliminate the tail rotor altogether. I figured that since no one wanted to spend all the time learning to hover, let's just make it so they flies forward like an airplane, because that's the way helicopters fly in forward flight. Well, that way the fixed-wing pilots who fly helicopters get used to seeing it and then graduate to the gas ones. So I began experimenting with the EH-550 that had just come on the scene, small electric helicopter. I actually flew it at the MAC show in Long Beach, California, doing demos inside. Well, it finally crashed and messed up the tail, and I couldn't get replacement parts, so that did it for me. Well, I cut a frisbee down and attached it to the tail. The finished version of the Hyperfly tail is the exact size of a standard frisbee. The idea was that frisbees create lift when flown, so if it flew sideways like on the tail, it would create a side lift, counteract the torque, and it did. And it also acted like a weather vane, just kept the tail back there, you didn't have to worry about it. Well, I took my prototype down to Vista to my flying friend Dave Robinger's, and we test flew it. This was the first attempt, and it worked perfectly. Well, at that point, I began designing my own version, trying to come up with something simple, including making one completely out of wood and a lot of other different versions out of PCB boxes, and you name it, I tried it. Well, Dave Robinger was a master machinist and he was making prosthetics, so he began helping me to make a good prototype. Once we got a good design, hand making blades, etc., trying to get the right torque and lift and the battery size, and it finally worked out, I went to High Tech in Santee and met Chen Park of High Tech RCD and showed him it fly. Well, Chen was really impressed. He told me to make a videotape, and when he went to Japan to meet with Kyosho, that he would present it to them. Well, that's what he did. He took it to Japan, showed it to the engineers and salespeople at Kyosho, and they absolutely loved it. So it was agreed at that point they would make it and I would get royalties. Aki Suzuki was the man at Kyosho that I began working with, and he also was the president. It took about 6 months to get the final production versions into the market, and it became Kyosho's best-selling product. It was sold through many outlets, and ads were in all of the magazines for a full 8 years. Kyosho then donated one to the San Diego Aerospace Museum for their History of Model Aviation display. I flew it in their parking lot for Ray Crowell, who was the curator of the museum, before it went inside to prove it would fly. Last year I donated the last one I had when the AMA Museum contacted me and asked if I had one to donate. Well, I donated the one in the box that was actually number 1 and given to me by Aki. It's a good thing I did, or that would have been burned up too. So then when Barry Thackeray of the United Kingdom sent me one just last week, I was ecstatic. So here it is stock, and I'm going to fly it stock. In the very first versions, we only had nickel metal hydride batteries and heavy receivers. So in this one, I've used a LiPo battery, and as you can see, the BEC for the receiver is simply a Zener diode to limit the voltage. I also added 1-inch wheels so I could land it without scraping up the landing gear. Well, eventually, Kyosho began making the Manta and Apache bodies for it, really sprucing them up. Well, then later on, Great Plains and Futaba struck a deal together to add a radio and make a combo kit with it, which didn't really help the USA Flyer, as the radio decided to apply was Mode 1. Well, no one could really figure that out here in the USA, but it was a big hit in Mode 1 countries. I had been begging Sean at High Tech to make a single-stick transmitter that could be used to control the cyclic, like on regular helis, but he came out with it too late. That 3-channel radio that he made later on would have been perfect, and when he finally did come out with it, I began using it in my Hyperflies with speed controls. You see, the Hyperfly flew wide open, and when it was time to land and it started to slow down, a person would just fly close to the ground, and the whisker switch that I designed just shut it off. But that way you wouldn't break, but you had to land it on a smooth surface. With the speed control added, though, the motor could be slowed down, which also reduced torque, making it really easy to fly. It even hovers in a headwind. And by jockeying the stick, you could use the torque to make tight turns and many other tricks, all with simply 2 servos. Well, I'm going to fly it stock just to demonstrate that now. I'm using an orange light receiver and my Spectrum DX8 Generation 2 transmitter. Later on, I'm going to add a speed control and 1 blade, and we'll see how that goes. Alright, let's go fly it. It's only 18. As you can see, you always want to take off into the wind. So let's see how this works. Here we go. you go. Oh man, is it cold out here. Well, that's how you're supposed to fly the Hyperfly. Once you figure it out, not too bad, huh?